wonder what happens after a hedge fund or a private equity firm buys a company? Or more specifically, a company like the Chicago Tribune? Does the paper become better? And what happens to all the people who work there? In the case of the Chicago Tribune, the sale to a hedge fund a few years ago resulted in a good deal of cost cutting because their goal was to maximize profits. Editors, reporters, columnists, several who won Pulitzer Prizes, were offered buyouts. Estimates were in the range of 40 or so people who took the buyout. Among the columnists leaving were Mary Schmid, Darlene Glanton, John Cass, Phil Rosenthal, Blair Kamen, the architectural critic, Howard Reich, Phil Vittel, Rex Hupke, and Eric Zorn. Most of these outstanding journalists went on to other writing because writers need to write. And our speaker today, Eric Zorn, is one of those writers. Eric joined the Chicago Tribune in 1980 and became a columnist in 1986 as an op-ed writer specializing in local news and politics, but also sports, arts, culture, all kinds of issues. Eric describes himself today as a journalist, writer, blogger, husband, parent, old-time fiddler, jolly good fellow, and former columnist for the Chicago Tribune. He also is the founder of the Picayune Sentinel, where he conveys big thoughts as editor of this online newspaper. Eric is a true blue University of Michigan graduate, go blue, and both of his parents were professors at Michigan on the Michigan campus located in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Let's give a big welcome for Eric Zorn.
I want to make sure not to omit Steve Chapman from that list of great columnists. Columnists who took a buyout. Steve Chapman is a great columnist, and he's one of the people who left. I will not tell my Jean-Jacques Bourse story. I was going to, but I don't want to steal anybody's thunder. So, thanks for having me here. It's nice to see you, and I'll talk a little bit about what I've been up to. I just want to start off by talking about this morning. The Tribune endorsed J.B. Pritzker, the next month's election for governor. And this is likely the last time in the 177-year history of the Tribune that you will see a gubernatorial endorsement in the pages of the newspaper. Last week, Alden Global Capital, which is a hedge fund that now owns the Tribune, along with about 200 other publications, announced that the company's newspapers are going to stop endorsing candidates in presidential, senatorial, and gubernatorial elections going forward. The announcement from them said, quote, unfortunately, as the public discourse has become increasingly acrimonious, common ground has become a no man's land between the clashing forces of the culture wars. At the same time, with misinformation and disinformation on the rise, readers are often confused, especially online, about the differences between news stories, opinion pieces, and editorials. It's all in Global Capital speaking there. Now, I'm certainly aware from my years as one of the public faces of the Tribune that some readers are in fact confused by political endorsements. What does it mean when I say that the Chicago Tribune has endorsed J.B. Pritzker for governor? me read a tiny bit of that endorsement for you. The COVID-19 pandemic, they say, was an extraordinary test for a novice governor with no political experience, and yet Pritzker approached his podium every day with a humility that was lacking among some of the prominent governors. He tried to speak the truth as honestly and as clearly as possible, to make decisions according to solid scientific evidence, to avoid hypocrisy in his own behavior and not hide what he knew. Even among those who did not support him politically, he engendered trust during some of the darkest hours in the history of this great state. It's hard to argue, says this editorial, that Pritzker has been fiscally irresponsible or that the state under his leadership has been log-jammed or chaotic. For the most part, Illinois has been efficiently run. Pritzker has hired capable people, persuaded them to work as a team. We got some good stuff done. We also say we also support a woman's right to choose. We disagree with Senator Darren Bailey's desire to get rid of the Illinois firearms identification card. And they see, the Tribune editorial board says they see community policing as the only way to fight the scourge of violence. This is a typically well-written, argumentative essay from the Tribune editorial board. And there are always at least a few readers who are under the impression that this endorsement reflects the consensus view of the journalists in the newsroom, the reporters, the editors, the photographers, the designers, the people who follow the current events closely, and who have to lay a plausible claim on having an opinion with more weight, more importance than, say, a similarly sized group of employees at Baxter or Boeing or Sears. So occasionally, people will impute to the reporting staff a political bias that aligns with the endorsement. Say, oh, you work for a pro-Pritzker paper. That's why this coverage seems to favor Pritzker in their mind, like that. And of course, this isn't true at all. These endorsements, like the opinions expressed in unsigned editorials, are the work of a discrete and increasingly smaller group of experienced journalists who comprise the editorial board. They operate independently of the newsroom, and they every so often infuriate the rank and file in the newsroom. And the idea is that members of the board write not in their own voices, but in the voices of, quote, the institution, an institution that, to read you from the Tribune Statement of Principles, believes in limited government, maximum individual responsibility, and minimum restriction of personal liberty. They believe in opportunity, they believe in enterprise, free markets, free will, freedom of expression. The Chicago Tribune is committed to Midwestern values and concerns, and it encourages constructive change in light of tradition and the lessons of history. Now, the idea that a general interest publication, newspaper, should have a guiding philosophy like this is really a throwback to the times of the partisan press. It's always seemed to me the newspaper's principles ought to be finding the facts, telling the truth, exposing misdeeds and corruption, and putting that all into context, which is a fair summation of exactly what the Tribune newsroom does, what the Sun-Times WBEZ newsroom does, what Block Club Chicago does, what most respected newsrooms do, Cranes, all these places, what they do. So why would you want to add an agenda on top of it, to layer an agenda on top of this basic mission of journalism? Why should this institution presume to promote limited government? TV and radio stations don't do it. News magazines don't do it. Universities don't do it, at least not explicitly. Tribune editorial board explainer on this, that's run several times, says in the disembodied voice of the editorial board, they say it would be an abdication to say what we think should be done on an array of issues every day and then remain silent about who is most likely to advance those goals. Now, before I unpack that, I want to note that the individual columnists at the paper, those of us who also regularly declared what we thought should be done on an array of issues, we were expressly forbidden from writing endorsement columns. Sorry? Oh, okay, sure. Okay. I'll say that again. That those of us on the paper, the columnists, the Chapman, Schmeek, Donnelly, you mentioned, Rex, we were forbidden from, even though we were weighing in all the time what we thought should be done, we were expressly forbidden from writing an endorsement saying, I'm going to vote for Pritzker, I'm going to vote for Hillary Clinton, whatever. We were forbidden from doing that. Even though we were simply speaking for ourselves and not clothing ourselves in the mantle of this institution. And why this was not considered an abdication was never adequately explained to me. I suppose the fear was that the institutional endorsement might get drowned out in the cacophony of individual endorsements. Let me circle back now to the we in that explanation, the editorial board, we. What does that mean to you? Does that mean that the endorsement reflects a majority vote by the members of the editorial board? My sense is that most people think so. They imagine a Supreme Court-like deliberative process. The panel makes the decision, takes a vote, and so on. But let's look at the actual explanation in the same editorial that explains endorsements. They say, after all our research, reporting, interviews, the editorial board meets to discuss the candidates or major endorsements. It's often a spirited conversation. Every member brings a unique perspective. The final decision rests with the editorial page editor. Now, this means, and certainly has meant, that the newspaper will endorse a candidate the editor of the board favors, no matter what the sentiments are of the majority of the board. And at some papers, like the Spokane Review, there's one person who makes that decision, happens to be the publisher. That's the person who makes the decision. Nobody else's opinion matters. This publisher, because he owns the paper, speaks not for himself, he speaks for the institution, which is his right. He owns the paper. But we should not fool ourselves as to what's actually going on, who is actually speaking, whose opinion this is. And I was never part of these endorsement meetings when I was a columnist at the Tribune. For the last dozen years of my career at the paper, I answered to the editorial page editor. My columns were published in that part of the paper that features editorials, editorial cartoons, and op-eds. I participated in just about every other meeting of the board, and I came to respect and admire all of them for their intellect, for their writing talent, and for the seriousness with which they took their mandate. People whose political opinions are maybe 90 degrees from mine, I have a great deal of respect for to this day. I don't know how many of you remember Kristen McQuarrie. She and I debated about just about everything, but I have a great respect for her intellect, for her approach to things. And same thing with some of the other people on the board whose politics were different from mine. They took their jobs very seriously and went about it very well. But because the endorsement decisions are very closely held, I did not participate in those deliberations. But I know from people who did that the Tribune's most famous or infamous endorsement, the 2016 endorsement of Libertarian presidential candidate Gary Johnson, was an example where the view of a ruling minority on the board prevailed over the majority opinion. And the fact that me just telling you this was seen as talking out of school is a betrayal of the confidentiality of that board meeting. Is pretty strange when you think about it. It's almost as strange as the idea that an abstraction like an institutional newspaper presumes to put its thumb on the scale of politics and government. Gary Johnson endorsement exposed the paper to ridicule that endures to this day, because the institution of the newspaper could not abide the candidacy of the unqualified narcissistic fraud Donald Trump, and yet could not possibly get behind the liberal policies of Hillary Clinton, perhaps the single most qualified person ever to run for president. The self-imposed rules of the game dictated that the institution had to make a choice, and has to make a choice in nearly all cases. Now, most editorials, so they're just talking about a topic, they can thread the needle and gracefully find middle ground. They can say yes and, or no, but however. These essays that embraces and explores the ambiguities of politics and public policy. Endorsements, though, cannot, which is why they have long seemed to me like a very blunt instrument. One name gets the endorsement, one name gets the thumbs down, is the loser. This is from the New York Times article last Friday. Newspapers in the United States, including the New York Times, have a long tradition of endorsing candidates, but in recent years, some outlets have questioned the practice or decided to forego it altogether. The Richmond Times-Dispatch in Virginia said the 2018 cycle would be its last. Ahead of the 2020 presidential election, McClatchy, a large newspaper chain, said its newspapers would not make an endorsement unless they had interviewed both candidates. Now, as significant as my reservations are about the stewardship of all in global capital, I think that here they are making the right decision. This is a quote from the Vanity Fair article about the same decision. A committee of editors from Gannett newsrooms nationwide reportedly recommended the company's papers avoid making endorsements in presidential, House, and Senate races during an internal presentation to the company in April. Readers don't want us to tell them what to think. They perceive us as having a biased agenda, he said during this presentation, citing editorials and opinion columns as not only among our least read content, but a frequently cited reason for canceled subscriptions. The headline this month at the Neiman Lab online publication read, "Every 4 years we shoot ourselves in the foot. Should news outlets still endorse political candidates?" Interviewing 64 US political journalists, we found that many of them have come to view their outlets' political endorsements as a liability. A click poll at Capital Facts. Anyone here read Capital Facts, the preeminent blog of news from the state capitol by Rich Miller, who writes in the Sun-Times periodically? He posted a click poll to his site. Recommend check that site out, capitalfacts.com. 59% of respondents to the poll, I think about 500 of them, said all the newspapers should stop all endorsements. Another 9% endorsed the proposition that papers should make endorsements only in smaller local races. There's the additional issue of whether endorsements in a major race make any difference at all. They serve mainly to inspire readers to cancel their subscriptions. In 2008, the Pew Research Center found that 70% of people didn't feel influenced at all by endorsements in major races, and the other 30% were evenly split. Say the Tribune endorsement, then I'm not going to vote for him, or Tribune endorsement, that I'm more likely. Albany Times Union editor Casey Seiler has a different view. He wrote this over the weekend. Editorials are meant to express a sharp point of view that's based on the best information available to the people writing them. Why should that not apply to candidates who are vying for the chance to set public policy on the environment, education, crime, every other topic that should matter to citizens, as well as opining on the policies themselves? Should an editorial board take a stand on, say, changes to the bail system or abortion, but stand mute on the electoral worthiness of a politician who bases their campaign on either issue or both? Style writes, I don't think that's a recipe for vibrant opinion journalism. I would add to that sentiment that I don't think anyone is saying that an editorial board or a columnist should stand mute on a subject like that. I think that they should definitely express opinions and explore them. I think when it comes down to making one of these binary choices, maybe they could leave that to the voter. John Alsop in the Columbian Journalism Review on the same topic. As you can imagine, what Alden did last week was a bombshell in American journalism, and all the newspaper outlets and the media outlets were chewing on this topic vigorously. He says the disappearance of common ground in public discourse becomes increasingly acrimonious, which is Alden's reason for dumping editorials, could just as reasonably be held up as a reason for endorsements, as a signpost in turbulent times, voters confronting ever higher stakes. The difference between nationalized races and local races feels arbitrary. Plenty of hyperlocal elections have recently been supercharged by national narratives. An example it gives of the school board races that have been so vicious and vibrant. And local and national politicians ultimately coexist on one continuum, can never be hermetically sealed from one another. It's totally fair to question whether an editorial board backing a candidate really furthers a newspaper's obligation to foster vibrant public discourse. But any decision to scale back should result from rigorous philosophical grappling with this question, and not from this reactive reasoning around reader perception, culture wars, or cost. And it's unclear if all of this recent decision was financially motivated. If they don't have endorsements, they've got more space for other things. They can conceivably drive away readers or advertisers. I think that's probably part of this equation too, that every time a newspaper endorses candidates, they lose subscribers. You don't have people like, oh, I didn't subscribe before, but now they've endorsed Pritzker, I'm going to subscribe. That doesn't happen. It tends to be more something like, I like Bailey, so they endorsed Pritzker, so heck with them. In 2016, my former boss at on the Tribune editorial board, former editorial page editor John McCormick, told the Columbian Journalism Review that swaying votes is only one reason for endorsing, and arguably not the most important. Every few years, John said, endorsements bring the publication to a full stop. They explain to the world what the publication is, what it advocates for, how it thinks, and what principles it holds dear. But to me, that begs the question of why a newspaper's journalism, its news reports, its coverage decisions, its mix in the opinion section doesn't suffice to reflect the values that the entire paper holds dear. That works for TV, radio, magazines. It works for Chicago and Justice Watch, The Reader, ProPublica, so many other news sites. And to be very clear about this, I am all in favor of opinion content in newspapers. I don't think that one voice, the ostensible voice of this fictional institution, should be elevated or given extra weight, especially given how small editorial boards have become, how few people that opinion represents. And I applaud the Tribune for keeping 4 pages of opinion content in these tough times. As everything else is shrinking in journalism, the Tribune has kept 4 pages of opinion content. I think it's wonderful. Gannett and other newspaper chains find opinion content divisive, but putting the best arguments against one another, let the reading public evaluate them, test them, decide for themselves. I think that is a high calling of American journalism. In my experience, I agree with those who say that readers don't like to be told what to think. They like to hear what you think and why you think it, and then test that against the best arguments for the other side, and then decide for themselves what they think. Who has the better case? Who's made the better argument? Now, when I wrote a column, I didn't always avoid this hectoring tone that you should think that, or taking a know-it-all attitude. It kind of comes with the territory of the column. But I never presumed that my position, paper, my job title, my experience, any other credentials I might have, automatically gave my opinion extra weight. I felt that my ability to persuade or cajole was based solely on the quality of the argument that I presented. And I hope that I presented a persuasive argument today that a newspaper will best serve its civic duty and its mission by presenting strong, reasonable cases on both or all sides of important topics and helping voters, readers, and citizens decide for themselves what they think. Now, what's happened when the Tribune stops doing these endorsements, I assume they're going to be still doing endorsements for mayor, for city council, for judges. Lots of people look to these institutions, these editorial boards, for recommendations in those areas. And I think that that is a service that they provide because they actually have the time. You have seen a lot of the ads already for governor. You've probably read a lot of the articles about who's ready for governor. You're perfectly capable of making up your own mind and weighing, and maybe you watched the disastrous debate last week. You're perfectly capable of making up your own mind about who you're going to vote for. You don't need to be told by an institution, but there may be some races down the ballot for water commissioner and for state legislature where you don't have the time to necessarily do all the background reading, and you'd like to read a principled argument and for voting for certain candidates or voting for certain propositions on the ballot. I think that that's a relatively decent service. I would not support stopping all those endorsements, but sometimes, which merged with WBEZ recently, technically BEZ bought sometimes, but for all intents and purposes, both those things merged. And because they are now operating under a nonprofit umbrella, they're no longer doing endorsements of any kind. That does not mean, however, that sometimes editorial page has become weak or has avoided tough issues. They have gone after many important issues and written strongly about those. There's a big question in my mind about where that merger is going. That really, to me, is the big story in local journalism right now. I guess there are 2 big stories. One is what's going to happen to the Tribune, but the other one definitely is how is this combined newsroom going to work, and how is it going to serve the readers in Chicago, serve the news coverage? Because you do not want, as much as people may criticize the Tribune for various things, endorsements or other areas of coverage, or criticize sometimes, you do not want to live in the metropolitan area that does not have a strong local newspaper. That it is terrible when one newspaper dies, and if both of them have to go to partial printing schedules and so on. It is the Tribune, it is the Sun-Times, it is Crane's, it is those publications that have people in the city council meetings, that have them looking over the public records, that have filing Freedom of Information Act requests, ones that are holding the politicians to account. And the less journalism you have, the less actual objective journalism you have, the more the crooks, the corrupt politicians have license to run free. I am hoping that the Sun-Times BEZ merger works well. I know people well at both shops. There's actually a lot of cross-pollination between them. They do really good work. They're supported philanthropically for the most part right now, and through the same way the public radio is supported. And I'm hoping that that works out well, because it's my view that the long-term future of daily print journalism is probably going to be nonprofit, philanthropically supported, the way you would support, say, a ballet company or a symphony or a museum, an art institute. That it is such a civic asset that the community needs to, it's going to need to rally around it. It's going to need to support these institutions, because advertisers are just not going toward print product anymore. I've got 3 young adult children. I don't think any of them, I'm sure, I know none of them read a print newspaper. And I don't imagine they ever will. They read on their phones. That's where they read. That's where they read everything for the most part, not even so much on their desktops. That kind of advertising is not really sustaining. You have to end up basically asking people to support you. And I hope that people do. People realize that the importance of that. 2 other areas of journalism that I'm very interested in that I think show great promise for information delivery. And one is podcasting. Who here listens to podcasts? Anybody? Yeah. Podcasting, the term dates back to 2004, and it's named after the iPod, which was introduced in 2001 as the Apple product. Download digital audio files and play them through your headphones. And the iPod line was discontinued earlier this year. So podcasting is going to end up being one of those terms that the question is, what is the origin of that term? That's going to be the answer to a trivia question at some point. But it has revolutionized a lot of things. It revolutionized a lot of storytelling. It's revolutionized the radio industry for sure. I've been involved in podcasts that's been produced at WGN for the last, I think it's like 7 years or so, that John Williams, who is their terrific midday host, it's called the Mincing Rascals. And it's a group of us journalists who get together, and the idea is this is what it would sound like if you went out to lunch with us and were kicking around the latest local news. And we had Carol Marine with us last week. We have Heather Schramm from Channel 11. We have Brandon Pope from WCIU. John Hansen usually joins us. And a whole host of this rotating roundtable. And it's a radio show, basically. It's a radio show with, I think, one ad in the middle of the beginning of it. It's like not one of these commercial radio stations where it shows where you've got 12 minutes of advertising an hour. We go for an hour, and I think there's like 30 seconds of ads for it. And this is very typical. And there are a reported 2.8 million podcasts out there on the various services. That was in August that somebody measured that. So we are at sort of peak podcast, and it's good for this kind of chat. And we spend about an hour getting ready to do the Mincing Rascals every week, but there are a number of really excellent, say, history podcasts. Don talked about Michigan. I listen to 3 different Michigan sports podcasts every week. Follow the team. There are any hobby you can think of, there are podcasts devoted to it, and it is essentially a radio show. And so if you're interested in, you can listen to, for instance, Morning Joe on MSNBC. If you watches that, all these morning shows, those shows are the audio from those is podcast just hours after it airs. And I think it just presents a great deal of opportunity for media, for information delivery. At the same time, of course, it's a threat, because anything that takes time, anything that takes your headspace, your attention time, is something that maybe detracts from the time you're going to spend reading the actual newspapers today, or listening to the actual radio station. And this is something that this is something that we wrestled with at the Tribune back in the 90s. I was on some of the committees that dealt with the idea of like, what are we going to do with this online stuff? They're like, well, we don't want to necessarily have people looking at the computers instead of our newspaper, because our newspapers, Marshall Fields at the time advertise. It's where all the car dealers, it's where all the movie theaters advertise. Well, so much of that stuff went away. The movie ads went away. The classified ads went away. A lot of the department store ads went away because they all migrated online. So you have to embrace this new technology. You can't fight it. I'm thrilled that the Tribune has gotten into news podcasting. If you listen to any one podcast that ought to really grab you, there's a podcast at the Tribune that's just rolled out. I think there are 5 episodes already about the Tylenol murders. Remember those 40 years ago? And Stacey St. Clair and Christy Bukowski, two of the paper's top reporters, spent about a year digging back through the whole story, and they tell it. It's been in print, but they're also telling it in podcast form. And the podcast form of delivery has been spectacular, really well produced, and it's an example of how you can really engage readers. And I mean, readers is almost an anachronistic term now. It's not just readers; it's news consumers, and you can engage them on all these different levels. And so, telling stories like this through that medium is a way of branding your company. And the Tribune's been a little, I have to say, they're a little late to the game. And we're in, year 18 of the podcast revolution. And it could have been a little faster on the draw. And I'm really impressed they're doing it. I think it's extremely well done. And the fact that they're doing it in this time of cutbacks in the newsroom is really a statement of great confidence in the future. And I'm sure that. The other medium, and I want to talk a little bit before I wrap up here about what I'm doing, and another area of media direction is the direct-to-reader communication that I'm involved with right now. My newsletter, the Picayune Sentinel, is on the Substack platform, and you can go on to Substack, you can email me or Zorn at Gmail, and I can sign you up for it. It gets delivered to your mailbox at 6 in the morning on Thursday, and it contains a whole bunch of different stuff that I've collected. It contains a bunch of links that I find are interesting. It's got commentary. I'm going to be talking this Thursday about some of the stuff that I spoke about today, about the editorial endorsements, offering my opinion. And what this has allowed me to do is write exactly what I want to write at exactly the length that I want to write it to people who really want to read it. And that has been an incredible pleasure. I left the Tribune in June of 21 with Mary and Steve Chapman and Darlene and all of the people we've mentioned before. John Cass left also. And we all left at the same time. And I took a couple months off to decide what it is I wanted to do, if anything. You know, I'm 64 right now, and it's certainly possible that I would just play fiddle for the rest of my life, which is something I would not be so bad. But I wanted to stay in the game. And Substack offered this opportunity, and they have a nice publication platform, and it's easy to reach people, and easy to get it delivered to their mailboxes, so that on Thursday morning and on Tuesday morning for other subscribers, I have these newsletters that come out, and I interact directly with them. The newsletter goes to them, and I tell people that I'm making about half as much money doing that as I did working for the Tribune, but I'm having twice as much fun. So it kind of works out. And this is not to say that what I did before was not fun. It was one of the great privileges and pleasures that you could imagine, being able to say, look, you've got a space in this newspaper 3 times a week, fill it with pretty much whatever you want, as long as you don't use swear words. But it was a little constricting. I know I had to write, the length was very constrained. You have to do 700 word sermonettes that you have to write, and I don't do 700 words anymore. Sometimes I'll do 1,500, sometimes I'll do 400. I did a thing just this morning on this. I didn't hear about this Amtrak disaster, where there's a train that took like 19 hours to get from Detroit to Chicago, and they lost power out in the middle of the field, and the toilets were overflowing. And of course, Amtrak didn't really know what to do with that. And so I was able to write, I wrote exactly what I wanted to about that, and I shook my finger at Amtrak and said, you guys have got to do better than this, because once word gets around that this can happen to you on Amtrak. And I'm a big believer in intercity rail, but if you can't deal with crises any better than that, then you've got a big problem. So I'm able to do all those sort of things, and a number of writers have done this. I'm really trying to talk Steve Chapman. because I think Steve is perfect for that. He continued writing syndicated column for about a year. Steve just retired from that. I think Steve is one of the great thinkers in American letters. Really, his column. You know, he's kind of this. I call him like a heterodox libertarian. He would come at he comes at these issues sometimes, and you read the first paragraph, and he'd say, "Oh God, he's lost it. This can't be right." And then by the time you got to the end, and he built his argument, you go, "Well, even if you didn't agree, you'd have to agree that he constructed a great argument." So I'm trying to talk to Chapman. I'm trying to talk to Mary Sheik and doing more. One of the things that I do in my newsletter is I scrape Mary Sheik's Facebook posts and I put them into my newsletter. And this is, of course, with Mary's permission. And that's one of the more popular features. People really miss Mary. I miss seeing her in print, and so it's a great way to deal directly. And of course, the other thing about it is that the people who signed up for it really want to read it. When you write for the Tribune, half the people in your subscribing audience are going to be disagreeing with you. So the volume of critical mail, I would call it critical mail, was much higher than now, because it's sort of a self-selecting audience. There's good and bad to that, I suppose. But it's been really nice to find people who really want to hear what I have to say and who really want to engage. And one of the things I do every week is I publish letters from people, and I try to respond in some depth to what they had to say, the arguments they made, the dissents that they might raise, and so on. So those are the things that I'm thinking could be and are possible ways that media can evolve using the new technology and so on. So that's what I'm up to these days. And I wanted to know if you have any questions or comments you want to raise. So.
Thank you, Eric. I must tell you that by reading the Sentinel this morning, I found out who the Tribune is George Butler before my subscription arrived at the front door. So you have a little head start. I wanted to ask this question. Do you think that the newspapers have an obligation to call out lies, untruths, and politicians? Do they have an obligation? Yes,
I think they do. And one of the things that I really missed about the coverage of the debate last week. You watch that debate Thursday night? Yeah. And Pritzker's calling Bailey a liar, and Bailey's calling Pritzker a liar. And what I really missed was this sort of rapid turnaround about, okay, Pritzker said this, Bailey called him a liar. Here's what, here's your fact check on that. Here's what's really happening here. I missed that, and I think that's really important. I would like to see all these political ads fact checked. I think that we are in this age now, and one of the things that's happened with these with the death of newspapers. The Tribune is okay; it's still going. The Sun-Times is okay. Cranes is okay in the city, but you're seeing local papers around the country dying off at an incredible rate. And when those papers die off, it opens the door for the kind of things that you've seen coverage about, which are this political propaganda that looks like newspapers. Shows up in your mailbox, and it looks kind of like a newspaper. It's got some stories about high school sports, but it's all extremely slanted. And I think that you really need newspapers to do the kind of fact checking that I'm talking about, because without that, it's got to be a high purpose. I don't know if you have to call them lies, but you can certainly call them fact checks. So yeah. Here I go. Sure.
Thank you, Eric. When this generation that we represent here dies off, do you see any future for a physical, wonderful printed newspaper anymore, or will it die with us?
That's a grim way of putting it, isn't it? I honestly no. I think what you will probably see is papers will go, and as they have around the country, not here yet, but around the country, they've gone to say publishing on Wednesday through Sunday or Sunday only. In my hometown Harbor, they basically publish twice a week, and it's kind of a shell of highlights from the website. I think that's going to increasingly start to happen. I just don't know any young people. I mean, as I say, my son is 32, my other kids are 25. They don't a newspaper. I mean, and so yeah, I think it's going to go away. But you have like I read the Tribune and sometimes digital replicas on my iPad. I prefer that. I can make the print bigger also with it. And I think that's what it's going to go. It's going to go to these increasingly versatile digital devices that'll make it so it kind of replicates that feeling without them having to cut down a bunch of trees and truck the trees to the paper mill and make the paper and take it to the printing plant and then deliver the news to your front porch 12 hours after it happened. You've got a situation right now with late sports and so on. It's always been a little bit of a problem. It's an even bigger problem. It's going to get even bigger when you can't even get normal home night baseball games into your paper in the morning. At some point, people go like, wait a minute, this is not isn't worth it anymore. I'd rather read it online. So I think that's my answer. I think they're going away. Yeah.
You made a really strong case for making your argument and not so much convincing. But state your facts and let the person say. How do you do that in today's environment where truth itself is coming under attack? How do you deal with the issue of truth? It's kind of a question Don was asking. That you call out lies. But do you feel that we're in a phenomenon now that might fade or life change in general? And faith is taking over fact for someone.
Boy, you're right about that. And there seems to be no penalty anymore for dishonesty or hypocrisy, and so you can't trust what people are saying. Now, when I say make your argument, I think incorporating, calling out those lies, calling out those misrepresentations is a really important thing to do. And that's the only way that I can think of to combat disinformation, to combat lies, is to try to develop a reputation for telling the truth as you find it. So that's the only way to do it. What else can you do? You could say he says this, but in fact this. And there are all kinds of misrepresentations just about this crime bill. It's the main issue in the governor's race. And people are talking about it. On January 1st, we're going to throw the doors open and all these rapists and murderers are going to walk out of jail. Well, that's completely not true, but it gains salience when we don't have neutral arbiters. And I think that it helps, just to circle back a little bit to my argument about editorials, it helps when a publication is not identified with, say, a J.B. Pritzker or a Jeremy that says, like, look, we're the umpire here. We're calling balls and strikes, and this is what we're telling you. We're not telling you this because, and again, I really want to stress the newsroom is separate from the editorial. It always has been. There's no overlap, but the public doesn't necessarily see that. But so that, I mean, to me, that's the answer: is developing a reputation for accuracy and honesty and thoroughness.
I wanted to ask you perception of the downstate legislature. He was one of the best politicians money could buy. And he only did that. Could you talk about downstate legislators?
Downstate legislators? I don't think I can. I don't know that much about downstate legislators. Well, the state legislature. I know some of the people in the state legislature, and I have respect for a number of them. I think there are people who got into it for the right reasons, and I'm interested to see how it's all going to go now that Mike Madigan is no longer around. I'm interested in seeing what happens with the city council. By the same token, now that some of these powerful aldermen are stepping aside, and how the mayor is losing a little bit of her grip on power there, I think having an independent legislature is a good thing. And of course, just broadly speaking, we need to have more and better ethics regulations and laws. And I think that the Democrats need to get more serious about that than they have been. Thank you.
Eric is a retired newspaper reporter.
Yeah.
There's not much to do about it, but So we're all living in our own little islands, news, self-select islands. It's a little bit like you either read only the nation or only the nation, nothing. May not read it, but it's exposed to different things. Definitely good newspaper. Never saw that. But there it was. But that's going away. The things sure what's going to really be replaced. Other than we ask ourselves, get out of our life. How many ever Fox News? So this is the question. Gumption to get off, see what other people are.
Well, I totally agree with that. That idea that we are fragmented, our media is so fragmented right now that you have everyone is in their silos. And it's comforting to watch 4 hours of MSNBC if you're liberal at night, and comforting to watch 4 hours of Fox at night because you don't really have to entertain the other side. You have to worry about the arguments that might cause you discomfort. And one of the things that the good newspapers did and still do is present different arguments. There was just a week ago or so, the Tribune ran two editorials on two op-eds on the same page, arguing one side and the other about this workers' rights amendment that's going to be on the ballot next month, and hardly anybody has heard much about it so far. But they did it was sort of pro and con. It wasn't actually laid out that way, but that was the idea. And you know, if you're reading one kind of publication, you're only going to read pro. You're only going to read con. And I don't think that enhances civic discourse, because at some point you want to realize that there are reasonable people who disagree with you. I mentioned Steve Chapman earlier twice now, 3 times now. That Steve would have, he would have different points of view, and he would support me. So you realize, okay, I don't agree with Steve about this, but I respect him. I understand where he's coming from. He's not evil. He's just, we have a difference of opinion here. And that is what I think one thing that a general interest publication or a cable outlet that tries to have both sides on manages to do, which is like, okay, I mean, I'm one of the few people who still misses that show Crossfire on CNN. I like that show. I like they had someone from the left, someone from the right, and they went at it, and so you could listen to both points of view, and you feel like at least they were fact checking each other. I don't know how to get around that. Just one point to circle back to the about podcasts and their influence. Just this morning, I saw in the New York Times that the Adnan Syed, who was accused of murder in Baltimore, prosecutors have dropped charges against him. He was the subject of a lengthy podcast series called Serial about 8 years ago, and they were building the case for his possible innocence. And in that podcast drew so much attention and so much interest that it's quite arguable that podcast freed a man who was wrongfully convicted. So podcasting does have big audiences in some cases, and it can have influence. So, and I'm thinking that this Tribune initiative on Tylenol is the same. But your point is really well taken, and I don't know what to do about it because there is no barrier to entry, right? I mean, it's one of the things about the old days was that it took a lot of money to have a TV station. It took a lot of money to start a newspaper. It takes no money to start a Substack. It takes almost no money to start up a website. You just got to get a little WordPress thing going and start putting stuff out. So there are all these voices, and the audience fragments, and the audience tends to go where it's comforting. And I don't think you want to be comforted necessarily in today's environment. You want to find out, the various arguments. Yeah. Sure. Okay. How do I get my news? Oh, that's a good question. I start every morning by reading Twitter, which a lot of journalists go to Twitter I have two separate feeds on Twitter. One is Chicago-based and the other is national-based. And I just scroll down and see what the publications have been tweeting out and what some of the writers who I know and respect locally and nationally are tweeting out what they're talking about. I will then read after I go through that and get a sense of what's there. And sometimes I save some of those articles to read later. I will go then to the Sun-Times and Tribune and read those in the digital replica format. All this on my iPad, sitting on my couch with a cat. And I'm always taking notes. One thing I do is I do screen grabs of interesting stories, just take photos of them. So in my photo library are all these things. And then after, so the Twitter, those direct me to stories. I don't actually go to the New York Times website or the Washington Post website, but I go directly to stories that are there. I get my news from that. And then if I'm puttering around, I will listen to Morning Joe or one of those shows, or I'll listen to the previous evening Chicago Tonight, which is also a podcast. If you ever watch that show, there's an audio podcast of Chicago Tonight, which is a really good source. I think it's the best source for local news. So that's where I get my news.
We have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Let me try to rephrase it. What are your thoughts about any more you want to add about social media? Historically, news come to us by our friends and network. With some things that change people, one person's here, then 10 persons later, something totally different comes out.
Well, this is a version of exactly the problem you were talking about a moment ago, which is that people on social media tend to rely on what their friends recommend. Their friends are recommending, so it solidifies the walls of the silo, so to speak. That when you're reading your social media feed and you're reading the news links that your friends are sending. The additional problem with that is that because it's so easy to create a website, so easy to create something that looks official, that has the name of the publication on it, that you're never sure exactly what you're reading. And I don't think that Facebook or Twitter even have the resources to necessarily filter out all these things and put flags on and say, look, this is just some guy. This is not, it looks like it's the Madison Times or something, but it's one guy in his basement spewing out his propaganda. And there's no way to tell if you don't know the various publications what those are. It does seem to me, I know from experience that most of Facebook has gone away from it. So they're trying to really de-emphasize that, rather showing pictures of people's meals and their cats and their kids graduating and their weddings and so on, rather than political stories. But it is contributing to the exact problem that we talked about a moment ago, which is that people just get into their own places and they don't look elsewhere for other arguments. So.
Last question. From Ed Cole. Speakers, your view on January 6th hearings and media coverage of that. And there may be others from.
Oh, yeah. My view of the coverage of January 6th?
Your view of the January 6th hearings?
I have great hopes for the January 6th hearing, and I feel like the media coverage has been pretty good of it. I'm pleased that it was covered live. I tended to watch it on YouTube because it's easier just to stay on. You can put it on pause and come back to it real easily. But I thought that the coverage is there. Now, a lot of these stories, the information is there, the coverage is there, but there's so many other opportunities. So people it's not just social media. It's like you got Netflix and HBO, and you've got Prime Video and all these other opportunities, other things to watch that are distracting you, taking your attention away. But the media is covering. The media are covering those stories pretty well. I think so. It's there if you want it, for sure. Sure.
Newspapers get large staff to cover events throughout the world.
They used to have staff.
How do podcasts?
Well, they won't. Podcasts won't replace. They'll supplement. Who will be doing it? Well, a lot. The thing about podcasting is that it has shown itself to be profitable because the audience is so easily identifiable and it's so niche. You can get money to support these operations. I think the idea would be that you would have these podcasts would reach a new audience and would fund that through new advertisers. That's the hope plan is that, and you would also get people, again, to go back to my kids. My kids might not pick up the Tribune, Sunday Tribune, and read the story about Tylenol, but I say, look, on your commute to work, give this a listen. It's an interesting story, well told, and that is a branding exercise for a place like the Tribune. It's a way of hooking people into being engaged with news things rather than saying just music or entertainment. But just I want to touch on this. The newspapers have big staffs. This is one of the things that's going on right now. Is that papers don't have the money they used to. They don't have the size staffs they used to, and that's a real issue because you want reporters in Springfield, you want reporters in county building, you want them in City Hall, you want them in Top Shop, you want them everywhere because they are our eyes and ears, and they're the ones who are going to tell us what's really happening versus what the officials want us to tell us what's happening. Out of time. Thanks.
Before we finish here, not everybody knows how to subscribe for free to your online Picayune Sentinel. Can you tell us how to do that?
Yeah, what you should do is just email me, ericzorn@gmail, and I'll just add you. That's the easiest way. You can go and search for it. The story behind the name, by the way, really quickly, is that my grandfather was an eccentric mathematician. If anybody knows anything about advanced set theory, they might recognize his name. He was an eccentric mathematician. He put out a mimeograph newsletter when he was a professor at Indiana called the Picayune Sentinel, and it was filled with arcane math jokes. And he sent it around the world, I believe, to other eccentric math professors. And I have most of the original copies of the Picayune Sentinel from the 80s, and they're impenetrable. But he can clearly delighted doing that. So when I decided to start this, I asked my dad, his son, I said, you think Opal would mind if I stole the name of his old paper and revived it? And my dad said he thought that would be okay. So it's a tribute to my late grandfather, Picayune Sentinel.
Eric, on behalf of everybody in this room and everybody on Zoom and all your readers everywhere, thank you so much for a very enlightening session.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.